BibleWorm, BibleWorm, reading the Bible with BibleWorm.
Welcome to BibleWorm, getting to the core of the biblical text. I'm Dr. Robert Williamson, professor of religious studies at Hendrix College and the founding pastor of Mercy Community Church in Little Rock.
And I'm Dr. Amy Robertson, director of lifelong learning at Congregation Or Hadash in Sandy Springs, Georgia. We're here every week to discuss the biblical text, both as biblical scholars and as people of faith, one Jewish, one Christian.
This week, we're pairing the Palm Sunday story in John 12:12-19, with the continuation of the crucifixion story in John 19:16b-22. We wrestle with the image of kingship in John's gospel, with the crowds hailing Jesus as the King of the Jews, even as Pilate sneeringly executes him as the King of the Jews. We contrast Rome's militant view of kingship with Zechariah's vision of an anti-militarist king, ultimately embodied in Jesus. We talk about the empire's way of violence and Jesus' way of self-giving love that refuses to exercise power over others, but instead lifts up even the ones who have betrayed him. And we discuss the danger these texts have posed throughout the centuries, especially for our Jewish siblings, and recognize the urgency of biblical interpretation that brings more love to the world rather than more violence. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Amy, how are you this week?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I am doing well. Indeed.
I know that you like to record these as though we exist outside the time-space continuum, but
Yeah.
I'm going to break that rule for a minute to tell you it's Purim!
Hey!
I just ate so many cookies right before we started recording.
Awesome. You look a little jittery.
I'm a little jittery. Yeah, they were very sweet.
So what does Purim involve in your place?
Purim in my place involves on a nearby weekend, we have a carnival for the kids. It's really just there's nothing religious about it. It's just a straight up carnival, and you wear costumes and you play games and you win prizes. Like, it's just fun. And for my costume, this will surprise you not at all. I was a hermit who lives in the woods. I put like dirt on my face and sticks in my hair. And I had some kind of sort of animal printy kind of ensemble that I found at Goodwill. Yeah, I lived in the woods.
Was that as sort of like a statement of your inner self that is resistant to having to be alone?
Yeah, it was like another Amy in the multiverse.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, this is not my life, and it's not that I want it to be my life. I don't necessarily want it to be my life, but I'm curious. I'm curious about it.
Yeah.
So anyway, we had a carnival, and then last night we read the Megillah, which is the book of Esther.
Yeah.
Which we did some of it chanting and some of it read in Hebrew, but reading it like it means something, like read with voices and parts and, all that stuff. And in between each book, there was a spiel, which is like a funny, it was really funny. The congregants wrote it and put it together. Play that sort of takes parts of the story or retells it in a different way. So this was the king Ahasuerus, who was in the beginning of the pandemic, and the signs of his wealth were all, he didn't just have all the streaming services. He had the premium streaming services. Yeah. And he didn't want to be interrupted from watching, all of every series in one sitting. It was I thought it was very funny. It was good.
That's
it was
awesome.
Very good.
Yeah. All right, so we are approaching Easter.
Mm-hmm.
We're making our way kind of slowly toward Easter. We've got today's text, and then we're going to have a Good Friday special episode. And then the Easter recording is the one up after that. So the text for today is the text for Palm Sunday. And the narrative lectionary has actually given us choices about what text we should read. So we have a choice of either 16b-22, which picks up right where we left off last time, or 12-27, which jumps back in time to the actual entry, a triumphal entry into Jerusalem, according to the Gospel of John, which occurs way, way back in John chapter 12. So we're going to do them both, but not exactly as they're written. So we're going to do John chapter 12, verses 12 to 19, and then John 19, 16b to 22.
I think that's a good compromise.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we've been talking back and forth quite a lot, actually, about what's going on in this, especially in this crucifixion trial scene about Jesus being a king.
Mm-hmm.
And this text back in John chapter 12, I think, shed some light on how John, the gospel writer, is thinking about Jesus in relationship to king.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do is we're going to pause, even though we're in the middle of a verse between 19a, where we ended last time, and 19b,
right.
where we're going to pick up later. We're just going to do like a flashback. If you were doing the the film setting of this would be a flashback moment.
There'd be like a smoke machine, a fog machine. Right. That's how you know it's the past. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're gonna flash back to John 12, and then we're gonna flash forward again to John 19.
Yeah.
Sound all right?
Good. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay, so we're in John chapter 12, beginning in verse 12. We skipped backwards 7 chapters, but really we've moved back in the lifetime of Jesus by about 4 or 5 days, something like that.
Yeah.
Before we read that, are there things we need to know to prepare us for the reading of this little section?
Here's just a little to like rewind our minds in the plot. When we get to chapter 12, Lazarus has already been raised from the dead. So that
just
has
in the
happened.
Previous chapter. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it has just happened. There has already been all this like consternation on behalf of the religious authorities that this has happened, and this statement that they felt they needed to put Jesus to death because it created a threat for the well-being of the Jewish community.
Yeah.
And then it's just about Passover, right? So the chapter starts saying it's 6 days before Passover. Jesus goes to visit Lazarus and his sisters, and he is then moving from Bethany into Jerusalem. So I think what I would raise up is like, raise up, get it? There's so many ways, so many get-its that could be in the raise up. Lazarus has just been raised from the dead. Jesus has spent time with Lazarus's family. It's almost Passover, and he's about to go into Jerusalem.
I think that was really nice. Can you just remind us, we've said a little bit about Passover itself. Is there anything just about, I mean, not necessarily like the meaning of Passover, but just like setting the scene for us about like what is going on in Jerusalem at this time?
I mean, Passover is I guess I would say 2 things. One is that we need to remember that with these festival holidays, there was an expectation, and as far as we know, really a practice for Jews to make every effort to come from wherever they were to Jerusalem in order to participate in the offerings that are made at the temple. That was like the primary thing that was done at that time. Needless to say, maybe not needless, but I'll say it anyway, this is not how Passover is celebrated anymore. Yeah. So that might sound foreign even to our Jewish listeners, but that was the way things were done. And so there was this huge crowd of pilgrims, Jewish pilgrims, coming to Jerusalem for the holiday.
And by this point, there's a Jewish community sort of spread all over the ancient world, all around the Mediterranean basin. Yeah. North, south, east.
And Jerusalem's not a big place, so I can't even imagine what it actually looked like on the ground, other than like Disney World on a good weather day or something. I mean, I don't even know.
Josephus tells us in Jewish Antiquities that his number is something like 2.8 million people in Jerusalem for the holiday. Now, presumably that's an exaggeration, but I mean, the fact that you could even come up with the number 3 million, and that seems like not completely unreasonable. Like that, there were lots and lots and lots and lots of people in Jerusalem. Yeah.
And then the other thing that I would just want to draw out that I think you have mentioned before as we've been reading John is, Passover celebrates really the birth of the people Israel by passing out of slavery, out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt, through the water, through this miraculous act of God, and coming out on the other side as a people, a mixed multitude that has become a people. and figuring out how to exist as a people with God as their king in defiance sometimes of, the local politics. And so it's a very weighty moment theologically, and I don't know. I've heard suggestions like maybe there were political overtones to it at different times in history. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really important, Amy. And, that last piece, even if Passover itself didn't have, but I think it did, sort of nationalistic overtones that are a little dangerous for relations between Judea and Rome. Just the fact that you've got so many people from all over the world who are all gathered together, there's a popular power that's there. And, there was an increased military presence in Jerusalem. I think we talked about last time. Pilate would move from Caesarea Maritima over to Jerusalem for Passover and bring soldiers with them. John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg have this book in which they talk about Jesus is coming in one side of Jerusalem on his colt or donkey, and Pilate's coming in the other way with his military processional. I think that's actually a little bit exaggerated, but the point is well made, that there is this sort of militarism on Rome's side because they're worried about the possibility of rebellion on the Jewish side. Yeah. And we read, if you read through Josephus, you get some indications of the kind of things that happen sometimes at Passover. It was kind of a tense moment. Mm-hmm. My favorite story about that, Josephus tells us that one time there was a Roman soldier who basically mooned the Jewish people. He pulled up his little tunic and showed him his behind. And they did not appreciate that. It was deeply offensive.
Really?
So there was a rebellion that started. Kind of sadly, it ended up a lot of people actually died in that one. So maybe I shouldn't be laughing. But the fact that it all started with a moon, to me.
I still think, even though this holiday has particular sort of nationalistic and political overtones, these moments on the calendar that have real religious resonance to them, it's easy for them to sort of, I don't know, the phrase that comes to mind is jump the shark, although I'm sure that's not the right phrase. It's easy for them to sort of it's like they have this hum about them of energy. And it's, I know still that when people are in moments where they feel deep connection to their religious beliefs, and then something happens that feels a little bit at odds with their belief, violence is easy to erupt from that. And so I feel that sort of buzzing of this text.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's not at all what jump the shark means, but your point is well made. Yeah.
It's not. That
Jump the Shark comes from an episode of Happy Days where Fonzie is skiing in his leather jacket, and I forget why, but there's a shark he has to literally jump over on skis behind a boat, and he does it. And then that was known as the episode where Happy Days kind of went off the rails, and it was never the same after that.
Right, so it goes off the rails. That's jumping. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay, all right.
You're
that's not what it means.
No, sorry.
But it's okay. It's okay.
It's okay. It's great.
All right. Yeah. So when we're picking up on this text, then we should see Jerusalem this way. There's 3 million people there, according to Josephus. Mm-hmm. There is this sort of buzz going on. There is a heightened Roman military presence. There is some tension happening. There is a major, major holiday that's about to be celebrated, which celebrates the freedom of the people from Egypt and potentially from all other oppressors. This is a moment. There is a
big moment, and putting it together with this moment right after the raising of Lazarus and having Jesus walk into Jerusalem it's a lot.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Okay, so I'm reading John chapter 12, verses 12 to 15, and I'm reading in the Common English Bible. The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him. They shouted, "Hosanna! Blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessings on the King of Israel." Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, just as it is written, "Don't be afraid, daughter Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt." So that's a short little text, but there's a lot going on in there, both, symbolically and also intertextual allusions to various things. So let's take these kind of one at a time and see where we end up. The first detail that's there is about palm branches. So the people are taking palm branches and they're going out to meet him. What is your take on the significance of palm branches?
I mean, so as far as I know, John is the only one of the Gospels that mentions palm in particular. Like they might have branches in the other ones, but it's not specifically this kind of branch.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
What I can tell you is that I associate palm branches with the holiday Sukkot, which is another of the pilgrimage festivals where, Jews would all be coming to Jerusalem. And as part of that festival, you put together 4 different species of branches into this thing called a lulav, and you shake the lulav in different directions. This is one of those symbols that has been interpreted 1,000 different ways.
Yeah.
It has something to do with God's sovereignty, maybe over all directions.
Oh, interesting.
Maybe. But I don't know if any of that is intended to be imported here, or if John is confused about when these branches are usually used, or if really they're just a nice shady thing that was available.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly what to make of it.
One of the things that's interesting is, palms don't actually grow in Jerusalem. They do grow down the hill in Jericho. So I think there's been some effort in importing palms into this story, either by the author or by the people. So I don't think it was just the case that they were like, ooh, we need something to grab, so let's grab some palms.
Let's grab some palms, yeah.
That theory that maybe John has confused Passover and Sukkot, I think is kind of an interesting one. John seems to have some familiarity with Jewish traditions. Maybe he was or had been Jewish himself. But I do think there is also some, interpretation going on. And so I think that's kind of an interesting idea. We also see palms getting used in 2nd Maccabees in relation to the rededication of the temple by the Hasmoneans, by Judas Maccabeus and his family after they defeat Antiochus and the Greeks. And palm fronds are waved in that sort of nationalist celebration. Palms appeared on the coins of the Hasmoneans. And in another 100 years after Jesus, they're going to appear on the coins of Bar Kokhba, who has a rebellion. So in thinking about what we were thinking about before with like the political tensions here, I think there's one way to read it, which is John is trying to heighten the political significance of Jesus as he comes into Jerusalem, exactly by having the people hail him in the way that, with the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans and the revolt of Bar Kokhba were familiar to them.
That is really helpful background. That's really helpful background.
So as Jesus comes in, they're shouting, Hosanna, blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord, blessings on the King of Israel, which is at least in part a quotation of Psalm 118.
Yeah.
What do you think John or the people, or however you want to talk about it, what is the significance of Psalm 118 being engaged here?
That's such a, I looked up Psalm 118 in preparation for this. And to be honest, I wound up spending so much time studying Psalm 118 that I had trouble finishing the rest of it. This is, it's like the psalm of all psalms. Like, I just feel like every other line in this psalm is so central to my religious life as a Jewish person and to Jewish liturgy as it is now. So I don't know. I'll just sort of, so it honestly, I'll say, felt like pretty weird to have this line placed here in the New Testament. And I know, again, I know this is a historical context and these are Jewish people, but this, Ana Adonai Hoshiana, save us, is the plea of the holiest days of the year. So to see it in here as look, it means Jesus is king is really mind bending.
Yeah.
But I digress. There's a lot in this psalm that, again, I'm not totally sure how much to import. This is the psalm that has the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And, this sense that God is your salvation, your the one and only option in the face of all kinds of ways that enemies might cut you down. So I guess putting those things together, like this, like recognition that God is the only option, right? The only thing that can save you from whatever is around you, with the idea of that, I don't know if they're pulling on the idea of the stone that's been rejected is the cornerstone, but it seems like a Christian reader might want to apply that to the idea of Jesus.
It absolutely gets applied to Jesus throughout the New Testament. I don't know if it's in view right here, but other places it certainly is.
In other places it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to equate those two, putting those two ideas together, God's our only salvation. And also, in the Psalm, I see it as viewing the Jewish people, the outsiders, not the divine one, who is the one who's been rejected.
Yeah.
But here I feel like it could be putting those ideas together in a just really, really different way than it appears on Psalm 118 by itself.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful, Amy. And I think that's, at some level, I think it'd be interesting to sort of work through the Psalm and see how that works. But even at the most mundane level in Psalm 118:26, at least in the Christian versification, the one who enters in the Lord's name is blessed. We bless you all from the Lord's house. The one who enters in the name of the Lord in the Psalm is the worshiper, right? It's you and me. It's the people. And here in John's narrative, when it's in the mouth of the people, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. It's a reference to Jesus. So Jesus has supplanted the worshiper, or has come to embody the worshiper, I guess, if you think about Word made flesh and Jesus is one of us, But there's, even in that simple line, there's this whole reworking of where does salvation come from and who comes into the house of the Lord, and,
Yeah. And to build on what you're saying, I feel like, Jesus sort of like takes the place of the worshiper or the, reader, but also in some ways takes the place of the one that brings salvation.
That's right too. Yeah.
Like Jesus winds up kind of in both roles.
As he should, according to the logic of the Gospel of John.
Sure.
Which is fascinating to listen to how you're sort of developing that. I think that's right on. You mentioned the word Hoshiana. That word has always confused me because it does, on the sort of surface, the plain sense of it is save us. It gets used a lot in contexts that seem to be contexts of praise, like right here. So you mentioned the word Hosanna, which they're crying out as Jesus is coming into the city. Based on your experience, your tradition, like what is the significance of calling Hoshiana? In what context would you do that, or why would you do that?
I have personally only encountered it really in these sort of like deeply pious, like really sort of like using it at face value, like save us, even if it's, in the context of worship, it's mostly, save us from ourselves.
Yeah.
Or, save us from the forces of the world, or, not necessarily like, save me from this plane that's about to crash. Baruch Hashem, have not been in that situation, so I don't know what would come out of my lips. So it's really interesting to think about what might be meant here if you're offering this cry as a honorific or a welcoming, or like is this some expression that like I don't know. Is this some expression that this is salvation riding in on a donkey, or am I importing that because I kind of assume that's what the author's going for? How do you understand the use of that phrase here?
Yeah, that's so helpful, Amy. Growing up as a kid, who like the only time I ever heard Hosanna was on Palm Sunday, really. And so I didn't know what it meant, but I thought it was like, yeah, like woohoo, kind of a thing. And when I started studying Hebrew and I realized what you're saying, Hoshiana means like save us, it transformed my understanding of Palm Sunday, actually, quite a bit, because it is exactly Jesus' saving capacity that they're calling out. And when you combine it with the waving of the palm fronds and the here comes some sort of a king figure, we're crying out, save us. I don't know that save us and praise necessarily need to be in conflict with each other. I think you absolutely could be crying out, here's the one who is going to save us. Like, yeah, save us. Instead of this sort of anguished cry. And I do think it is exactly in that cry, there's a recognition that their people realize there is something from which they need saving. And I don't know exactly what they think that is, whether it's the Romans or... I don't think they're crying out like, save us from our sins, even though maybe that's what John's going to try to do with it. So hanging on to that sense that what they are crying out is save us, and they think that in some way or another, Jesus is the one who can save them, even if maybe they don't understand exactly the way that's going to play out. They have a sense that it is indeed the case.
I love that, and I'm sitting here quietly because now I'm thinking, and then the next line is the King of Israel.
Yes.
And so I'm already sifting through how, before I read it and I was like, the King of Israel, that's not in the Psalm,
Yeah.
But I'm thinking of the ways in which that background that you just offered sort of ties in again to these like palms that they're waving and the call to save us, lead us, deliver us, and now calling Jesus King of Israel.
Yeah. And we have struggled with this word king for the last few weeks, and, Jesus and Pilate have talked about it, and Pilate and the Jewish leaders have talked about it. We've talked about how back in chapter 6, the people tried to make Jesus a king and Jesus ran away. Here we've got the people directly calling Jesus a king. They're calling Jesus a king. Blessings on the king. Like, here you are.
Yeah.
Jesus doesn't say, yep, I'm the king, but nor does he run away. Like he seems to at least not protest against this name for him.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right. It's not in the Psalm anyplace. And so the people are in John's gospel are naming Jesus, the king, the one who has the capacity to save us. I don't know this is an important moment in the Gospel of John and in what John's trying to do via kingship. I think we can continue to develop that as we read on in the text, but is there anything to say at this moment other than that's important?
I think what's coming to mind as I listen to you sorting through these different ideas and images that are being pulled together here is, the texts that we're about to look at in verse 15 that also come from other places in the Hebrew Bible. Your king is coming, sitting, this idea of like having the humble king coming in and just riding a regular old donkey.
Let's go ahead and talk about that, because that is obviously part of what's happening in this text.
I think I think attaching the kingship first to Psalm 118 in my mind, and I don't know that the people saying it would have thought this, or maybe it's just John at work here, but it stretches the boundaries of what king could mean.
Yeah.
Because in Psalm 118, the person who's saving you is God. It's not a king.
Yeah.
And so the kinds of saving God can do, a king can also save you in some ways, but it's a really different kind of saving. So I feel like placing Jesus between these two different references muddies up that category or expands it, or Israel was expecting another king to arrive at some point, right?
Yes.
And that was the Mashiach, that was the anointed one, the Messiah, was a king, a regular old king who was human and going to protect them from their enemies and, fight the good fight and bring peace to the land.
Yeah.
And this is, by putting him in the place of the divine instead of the place of the human king in Psalm 118, it really messes with that a little bit.
That's really helpful. And, you're talking about messianic expectation, and I think that's right. That is right, that many Jews at the time were expecting a king who would come and restore Israel. sometimes this gets played as the Jewish people were expecting a militant king, and instead what they get is Jesus, who is a non-militant king.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that binary is exactly helpful. Because what I really think, and you were alluding to this, is that the Jewish people had different expectations about what that king might be like. And some of them were expecting a militant king, and some of them were expecting something else. And this invocation of the king on a donkey's colt is actually a quotation, as you well know, from Zechariah, prophet 9:9 is where it comes from, which describes the king humble and riding on a donkey on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And then it goes on to say, he will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations, his dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. So right there in Zechariah, you already have a king whose exactly his role is to come humbly and peacefully. And the way that he makes war is by destroying the implements of war, right? So he's not a militant king. He's actually an anti-militant king. And so that's in the Jewish expectation, or at least in one branch of it anyway. So Jesus is coming, I think, in this moment to say, okay, to the extent that I'm a king, I'm that kind of king that Zechariah was expecting, not this other militant kind of king that some of you zealots and rebels might be expecting. So it's not like Jewish versus Christian. It's like pacifist versus militarist or something like that.
That's so cool. So are you thinking... Now I'm seeing this more as like a scene unfolding in the story instead of just sort of like a moment that's being reported. So the people call out this thing to Jesus, and now I'm hearing it as Jesus wants to communicate something about the kind of leader or the kind of king that he is. And so he finds a young donkey. It's not just like Jesus got tired. And there was a donkey, but that I love that. I love that.
Yeah, I appreciate you putting that fine point on it too, because in the other Gospels, Jesus has the donkey before he comes into town. There's this whole thing about how he goes and gets it. But in John's Gospel, it's not that way. It's he comes into town and they're shouting Hosanna, blessings on the King of Israel. So he finds a donkey and sits on it. I think that's exactly right. He says, okay, you got this far, but now let me show you by sitting on this donkey.
What's next. Yeah.
Now, the very next line in verse 16 is his disciples didn't understand these things. After he was glorified, they remembered and they understood.
Yeah.
And to me, that seems really important. So as this thing is unfolding, nobody understands the significance of what Jesus just did.
Yeah.
But once he's been crucified and resurrected, now they can look back on this scene and say, oh, he was talking about pacifist king who's going to give his life, not threaten violence.
Right. Cut down systems of violence. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. It's Bobby here from the BibleWorm podcast. Today, I want to tell you about a group called the BibleWorm Collaborative, which you can join through our Patreon. The BibleWorm Collaborative is a group of BibleWorm listeners who meet together to collaborate on our interpretations of the biblical text. Once a month, we meet on Zoom to discuss the narrative lectionary text for the following month. Amy and I often draw on the questions and insights of the collaborative, giving you a chance to shape the direction of the podcast. Starting this month, BibleWorm Collaborative members also have access to a new, exclusive Discord group where you can discuss the text with other collaborative members, offering insights, asking questions, and sharing resources. Amy and I check in regularly to offer our thoughts as well. Collaborative members also receive early access to episodes, a terrific BibleWorm sticker, and the satisfaction of supporting a good cause. You can become a member of the BibleWorm Collaborative by joining our Patreon for just $14 a month. See patreon.com/BibleWorm podcast for details. And now, back to this week's episode. Okay, I just kind of summarized verse 16. I'm just going to pick up in 17 and read to 19.
Okay.
The crowd who had been with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead were testifying about him. That's why the crowd came to meet him, because they had heard about this miraculous sign that he had done. Therefore the Pharisees said to each other, "See, you've accomplished nothing. Look, the whole world is following him." So in this gospel, John points us back now to Lazarus as the reason for the crowds. Lazarus is not even in the other gospels, so something different is happening in John than was happening in the other ones. How do you think about that?
I think it's so interesting that at this is a point where it goes back and says that's why the crowd was there, you know, in the first place. And I think it really, you know, you have said numerous times over the weeks that like the quote unquote problem that the religious authorities are worried about is all about the raising of Lazarus. And it's not that I disagreed with that per se, but this is really sort of underscoring.
Yeah.
That was the thing that ignited the people, you know, and I'm thinking back to when we read that text together and I kept talking about how painful it was that Jesus waits, intentionally does not go, but says like, this is what has to happen. It has to happen this way.
Yeah.
And now I can see all of that sort of playing out, that yes, that surprise, surprise, Jesus was right. You know, that it has to happen in that way. And that's what ignites the people. And also the Pharisees are right that it's ignited the people.
Yeah. That's what they said was going to happen at the end of chapter 11. And that's what's happening now.
Yes.
So they saw it correctly.
Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me, especially after last week's conversation, is just that, you know, what the Pharisees had said in chapter 11 is the people are going to respond to the power of life. And then the people here are responding to the power of life. And they're saying this guy has the power to wield life instead of death. And we want to be a part of that. And yet we know, because we've been ahead in the gospel, how that's going to get twisted by the leadership or by fear or by the way humans are. I don't know how you want to talk about it. So that by the end of the gospel, well, by the end of chapter 19 anyway, the power of death has defeated the power of life, at least for a moment. But this moment feels so hopeful to me right here in chapter 12. And in some ways, like doing the flashback thing is kind of helpful because you're like, well, I know where we're getting ready to go, which is that they're going to end up wielding death to defeat the one who can wield life, and how tragic that is.
Yeah.
And how true to human nature, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
All right, anything else we want to say about this Palm Sunday text before we jump back to the Pilate narrative?
I want to jump, I think. Now having all this sort of in my mind, I want to go back and see where we are.
Okay, so we're going to move then back to where we were a week ago, picking up in John chapter 19, verse 16b. Is there anything that we need to remind ourselves about before we dig in?
I mean, I think the only thing that's just really running through my mind is that there's been this whole conversation about, you know, what exactly is the crime Jesus is being accused of. And there's, you know, first it's that he claimed to be the Son of God. And then the religious authorities say everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor as a way to get Pilate to act. And then, you know, when they bring Jesus out, they say to the Jews, "Here is your king. Shall I crucify your king?" And the priests say, "We have no king but the emperor." Like there's a lot of king language, and it will continue like that. I guess that's an important thing to hold in conversation with that text we just read.
I think that's right. I mean, that is exactly right. And there was that whole conversation that Pilate had with Jesus where he said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "You said that. I didn't say that." Right. And then, so you are a king. And we talked about that sort of like, oh, Jesus is a king, but he's not a king. And his kingdom is from, Jesus says, "My kingdom is from somewhere else." And we talked about like, okay, can you have a kingdom but not be a king? And so there's just been this whole, all the way back into chapter 18, there's been this kind of whole complicated discussion about kingship. I think that's important background.
Yeah.
Okay, so just right before this, as you were saying, Pilate has brought Jesus out and said, "Do you want me to crucify your king?" And they say, "We have no king but the emperor." And so Pilate has handed Jesus over. So picking up in 16b, the soldiers took Jesus prisoner. Carrying his cross by himself, he went out to a place called Skull Place, in Aramaic Golgotha. That's where they crucified him, and 2 others with him, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a public notice written and posted on the cross. It read, "Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. Therefore, the Jewish chief priests complained to Pilate, "Don't write 'the King of the Jews,' but 'This man said, I am the King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I've written, I've written."
Hmm.
Okay, so the beginning of this text is Jesus carrying his cross out to Golgotha.
Mhm.
Any responses to that image of Jesus carrying out the cross and being crucified between the two criminals?
Oh, that was just a lot of things all in there.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
You want me to just- let me-
No. It's good. I have two things that sort of jump out to me in the description of him carrying the cross, and I don't know if one is more important than the other.
Mm.
But one is, at least in my translation, it says carrying the cross by himself.
Mm-hmm.
And so the aloneness of it is sort of tragic in its own way.
Yeah.
And then it is another level of tragic, or another layer of tragedy, that he is carrying the means for his own destruction.
Yeah.
The image reminded me a little bit of these images you see from World War II and certainly other wars too, besides World War II, where Jews are digging the pits that their bodies will fall into when they're going to be shot, and just that sort of extra like twist of the knife that's like, you're going to help facilitate your suffering and destruction. Does one or the other one of those stand out to you more, the aloneness or the twistedness of it? Or do you think they go hand in hand as just like, this is really the worst. This is just the worst thing.
That's such a poignant and powerful way of describing that, Amy. This was the Roman practice. As we understand it, they had the vertical poles sort of in place, and then the one who was to be crucified would carry the crossbeam, and then that would be attached. They would be attached to the crossbeam, and then that would be attached to that vertical pole. And the Romans, I think, did this exactly for what you're describing, to humiliate, to turn the knife, as you say, to add one more painful insult. You have to carry the means of your own execution. And I think that's exactly what the Romans intended. And I think John's picking up on the cruelty of that practice.
Yeah.
The aloneness one, I think, I'm having to think about that too, because absolutely, Jesus has sent home his disciples. He has been denied by Peter. We're going to find out when Jesus is crucified, like when he's actually on the cross, he's actually kind of chatty in John's gospel, which is sort of surprising. But in this moment, the aloneness of that, I think, is exactly right. In the Synoptic Gospels, there's another character here, Simon of Cyrene, who Jesus gets tired and drops his cross, and Simon picks it up and carries it for him. And so there's this sense of companionship, but also the sense of Jesus can't handle it.
Yeah.
So I think we're talking about cruelty of the empire. I think we're talking about aloneness. And I think we're also talking about Jesus is in charge of what is happening here. Right? Jesus has said this is what's going to happen. It has to happen. He has to die this way. He has dodged questions to get to this point where they crucify him. And he's, in John's gospel, able to carry his own cross. He's not in need of anyone to help him. I don't know exactly how you put all those strands together, but I think they are all in play here and important in John's image.
Bobby, I've had a question just popped into my head that if you feel like it's too far afield, then we can just table it for another time, for a rainy day. But I hear sometimes in the Christian world the phrase like carrying your cross or like bearing your cross. And I just described the cross as, you're basically being made to carry the means for your own destruction, like facilitate your destruction.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's what's meant by the phrase when it's used now. Is that right? Does it mean just sort of like, bear your burdens?
Jesus says in the Synoptics, if anyone wants to be my follower, they must take up their cross and follow me. And Christians use that now, like, that's my cross to bear. And we mean that like I drink too much soda. Or, like we use it about like silly things. About like, oh, like this is a minor inconvenience to me. It's my cross to bear. But that's not what it meant, right? In the Gospels. And that's not what this means. Sometimes I'll play with it like in a worship setting and I'll say, pick up your electric chair and follow me. Or pick up your lethal injection needle and follow me. Just because it shifts, like the cross has
it shakes us out of. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because what Jesus is saying there is exactly what you're saying, which is take up your means of execution at the hands of the empire and let's go do this thing, which is emphasizing the danger of it and the deathliness of it and the opposition of the empire. And we lose all of that, many of us, when we use that phrase.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
And we get this public notice, and we don't get this we get the public notice in the other Gospels, but this back and forth, the notice says Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Mm-hmm. And it's written in 3 languages, Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. Mm-hmm. Before we get to the objections about that, just any thoughts about that being the label and the multilingual nature of it?
I mean, it's tempting. Well, I find myself trying to figure out trying to think about like Pilate's motivation for that, or if it's just, John is sort of really enjoying the irony of this moment. But, even before we read on about the objections from the leadership, when I read that, I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
That's not like, is this meant to be a slight against the Jews also? Like, or was it meant mostly to mock Jesus and the idea that, if Jesus had claimed kingship, it sort of really draws out the distance between being a victim of crucifixion and having the power that was imagined that a king would have. But it also seems like it could shame the Jews by association, that their like most exalted representative, the king, has died in this way.
Yeah, it's complicated by the fact that the Jewish leaders have never said Jesus is the king. In fact, they've been saying exactly the opposite. Like the problem is he thinks he's a king, or the people think he's a king.
Yeah.
The people, as we saw back in chapter 12, have called him the king. And so it's kind of an interesting question about, one way of reading it is just anyone who gets a following that threatens Roman power, this is what's going to happen to you. And so the fact that you have been called king means you're going to have to die this way. I think it is absolutely meant to humiliate the Jews and the people, the occupied people of the empire, that, the empire has the power. Pilate has power. Caesar has power. You do not have power. And so anyone to whom the title King of the Jews is remotely applicable, this is what's going to happen to you. And so, this is a warning for everyone. Like, don't think of yourself in those terms. Person of power.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I answered your question though.
No, I think you did. I mean, in some ways it's quite a masterful way to cut down a whole bunch of people who really fundamentally disagree about what's happening here.
Yeah.
But it's like insulting and hurtful. I mean, obviously to Jesus, who actually is suffering on the cross, and also to the people who were followers of Jesus and may have believed that he was a king, and also to the people who believed that he was not a king, because now they're saying, oh, this is your king, and look, he's been crucified. Like, it really, if I had moments reading this story where I felt like the Jewish community and Pilate were together in some way, at this moment, it becomes very clear to me that they are not.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful. So Pilate here has exerted his authority. He's been a little mushy along the way, like sort of open to being influenced. And then all of a sudden he's like, nope, I've said what I've said.
Yeah.
And you and I are not the same.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Right, but I don't think it's necessarily that he's making some kind of wise, insightful statement in support of Jesus's,
Oh, no.
or anything like that. I think, well, I wrote a word in my translation that I can't use on a PG
iTunes will get mad at us.
podcast for this kind of leadership. But yeah, it just seems a very sort of like flippant insult across the board. Like he's not actually invested in any of this or in any of how this plays out or in what is actually true and what's happening here. He just doesn't. He's playing.
Yeah. We talked last time about how one reads Pilate. I think it was last time. They all kind of run together for me. But
yeah.
The conversation, the truth conversation, maybe that was 2 weeks ago. But there's a question about whether Pilate is actually like a deeply philosophical person who's interested in the concept of truth and wants to talk about that more with Jesus, or whether he's a master propagandist who is discarding the whole notion of truth.
Yep.
I think one can read this moment similarly, where Pilate could be saying, like, no, I have really understood Jesus is the king, and so I'm labeling him correctly. You don't get it, but I get it. If you read it that way, then John's gospel is excusing the Roman Empire and saying I guess it's excusing the Roman Empire. It's at least saying the Roman Empire understands.
Right. Then there's a question of why they did this, but fine.
But the other way of reading it is which is the way I tend to read it too, which is that Pilate is using this label as a way of dismissing everybody, making fun of Jesus, making fun of the Jews, making fun of the religious leaders, making fun of everyone who is not Roman because they don't have any power. And he wants everybody to know. That's the way I tend to read it. This is an example of cruelty and just disregard for everyone. Yeah. But I do think I think it's open to how one reads it.
Yeah.
Now John, of course, means that, there's a deep and profound truth to what Pilate has posted.
Yeah.
According to the Gospel of John, like Jesus is the King of the Jews, and the label has gotten it exactly right. Even if nobody meant it that way, the label is, Jesus has been labeled correctly, even though probably nobody really thought he was that's in the story so far. What do you make of the multilingual nature of it? Anything?
It's so interesting. I mean, the whole way that it's described here being, in multiple languages so that anyone could read it and sort of right near the city so that, it's this right near the city of Jerusalem at Passover.
Yeah.
So it's like a bustling scene where everyone can see this. I'm wondering as I say this, I don't know who spoke which languages. Jews spoke Aramaic and many of them Greek. I don't know who was speaking Latin. Would that be mostly the Romans?
Yeah, I mean, Latin and Greek were the languages of the Roman Empire at this moment.
Okay.
Basically, the Western Empire still functioned in Latin. The Eastern Empire still functioned in Greek.
Okay.
And so a Roman in Rome would have functioned in Latin. A Roman in Asia would have functioned in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a way of saying, like, this is the languages of all the world, even though that's not exactly true.
Yeah.
But the language of the Western Empire, the language of the Eastern Empire. And then, Aramaic was the lingua franca of, like, the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. Like, that whole region spoke Aramaic at points along the way. So I think that's what it's after, is basically saying anyone in the world who is able to read could read this label.
Mm-hmm.
John 3:16 said God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten son. And to me, this captures that. Like, there's a specificity about Jesus that he is the Jewish king. But the global nature of the label says, and he has a broader significance than that.
Yeah.
So on the mundane level, I think it's so everybody can read. Pilate wants to make sure everybody knows why this guy is crucified. But on the theological level, I think it's saying this Jewish king, this one who came in this specific form, is here on this cross for the whole world.
Right. Right. This is a story for the world. This is not just a story for the Jews. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so as a way of pulling these two kind of texts together, we've been thinking about this idea of king. Is Jesus a king? Is he not a king? What kind of king is he? We've been talking about that in different ways today and for a couple of weeks. So at this moment where Jesus is labeled King of the Jews under protest in multiple languages, like, can you bring us any sort of, I don't know if resolution is exactly right, but like, how do you unpack the symbolism of king here at sort of what I think is the culmination of that idea?
I think the two main ways that I'm thinking about kingship at this point in the text are a somewhat traditional one, which you can say is more militaristic or less militaristic. But the idea that like this is a king who's going to deal with human issues on the earth and is going to bring peace to Israel, to the land, to the people. And then this idea of kingship as a way to overturn like the ultimate worry, the ultimate enemy, the ultimate force that is against us, which is death, right? So there's that sort of human level and the metaphorical level. And I feel like at this moment in the text, it looks pretty hopeless for both of them. You know, like this is the king who overcomes death. Well, I mean, I guess he hasn't died yet, but
it's pretty clear where we're headed.
It seems to be that this is where that's going. And whether you're expecting a military leader or a great negotiator or whatever, issues are there's been no peace. Now there is disagreement within the Jewish people. There is still disagreement between the empire and the Jewish people. There's like things are not better. Death has not been overturned and peace is not here. So seeing the word king over that image to me is a really pointedly hopeless at this moment. I know there's more to come, but it seems pretty bad. How do you pull all those different king resonances together in this moment?
I love what you said, Amy, and I think that's exactly right. And you know, there's a triumphalistic way of being Christian, which many of us inhabit, including myself from time to time, which I think is not actually at all what the Christian story is inviting us to. And that sort of hopelessness that you're identifying, I think is super important, because the point seems to be, here was the king who came in humility, wielding the power of life over and against the power of death, and he got killed for it. And as near as any of us can tell in this narrative moment, that's the way the story ends. And so if the call of the Christian is to love one another as I have loved you, which Jesus said it was back in John chapter 13, then what that means is, you know, you can't use the power of death in order to defend the right to, like, the power of life. If you come wielding death in order to give life to people, you're really on the side of death, right? You know, if you have to maintain prosperity by killing people, you're not really doing the thing. What Jesus has offered is a whole other way of being, which is in self-giving love that for him ultimately results in his death. And, you know, for Christians, I think we ought to expect that it might look much like that for us too, in the eyes of the way that kingship's supposed to work. Whatever kind of way you want to frame kingship, it's going to look like failure. And it's only on the other side of the resurrection that this story starts to look different, but we're not there yet in the narrative. And we're not there yet in the living of our daily life either, I think. We don't live in the sort of fulfillment of history. We live in the messy in-between space. So I think dealing with that hopelessness and the apparent failure and finding a way to say, like, this failure is not actually a failure, and neither is our failure. That seems to me to be the point, and it's so easy to lose.
Yeah. Well, understandably, we want to go through this part as quickly as possible,
Yeah.
you know?
I was so annoyed that the narrative lectionary made us stay basically in this chapter and a half for like a month. I'm like, oh my goodness, how long can we linger over the trial and crucifixion? But I think that's actually been a good thing.
There's a lot of truth in it. Yeah.
Amy, I feel like I just jumped the shark by saying what I think this text is about and how we ought to be processing it today. So maybe I've already said what I need to say about that. But I'm curious what you would say as you read this text and you think about how it connects with contemporary life. Where does your head go?
My head is going back to some of the conversations we've had about truth and the idea of, Jesus as an embodiment of truth in bodily form, and the importance of truth in both of our traditions. And I think watching the way that this scene plays out with Pilate and the religious leaders, and, sort of all along the way we've been saying, no one will say what they actually think. Like no one will stand up for what they actually think is true. The religious leaders are trying to figure out how the empire will respond and like anticipate their response and then sort of preempt their response. And Pilate, it seems, is also maybe doing something like that, or maybe playing some other kind of games, and maybe not even trying to figure out what's really true. And it doesn't work. Like, this is all great, like there's this song we sing at Purim, actually. And the translation is something like, go ahead and scheme your schemes, but God is with us, and that's how all of this is reading to me now. Like, scheme your schemes. You can do your best to try to outsmart the system, but like the truth is gonna come get you. And here is, just in a political way, I feel like that's how that winds up turning out. Like, they're both sort of trying to, maybe I shouldn't say they're both, because I don't know if Pilate really ever felt vulnerable. I'm not sure. But if the religious leaders ever really felt vulnerable to the power of the empire and were trying to make nice, it did not. You lose control over the narrative, and you cannot just align yourself with whatever you need to in order to bring about an end that you think will come. You're much better just saying what is true that might also lead to your death. Like, there's no way to game the system. So you might as well say what's true. What you think is true. What you genuinely figure out, what you genuinely truly think is true, and say that.
I love that, Amy. That's so helpful. And in the world of the Gospel of John, what is true is love one another as I have loved you. Like, what is true is God so loved the world that he gave his son to love to the end. And so I really love that emphasis on say what is true. I think in John, it's also do what is true, which is love each other no matter what it costs. And I think ultimately for John, it's be in relationship with Jesus, who is truth. But I mean, you can get a long way toward what John is after, loving one another in a selfless way, without that last step, even of saying that, if you're trying to think about how do you read a gospel in an interfaith way that doesn't require Jesus to have been the Son of God, like there's something profound, I think, there about love one another. That's what's true.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked a lot about who's at fault for Jesus's death. And, John's gospel has been read, as you well know, in lots of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish ways. And the more we read this together, the more that I really think what John is saying is anyone who is committed to the power of death, anyone who thinks that might makes right, anyone who wants to wield power over instead of giving oneself in love to another, that's who's at fault for Jesus's death. And I dare say that's humankind. And the point then is that it exposes that tendency in all of us.
Yeah.
I keep coming back to how Jesus washed Judas's feet at the Last Supper, and Even Judas got Jesus to lay down his life for him. And so in some ways, like to say, like, look, we all betray that reality or that version of truth of love one another no matter what it costs. And in the Gospel of John, God's capacity to forgive is bigger than our capacity to betray.
Yeah.
I think that's an important way of reading this gospel.
I think that's really right. And I think, I love that you brought in the washing of Judas's feet because one could imagine a case now where like, no, of course you can't wash the feet of your enemy because you are trying to bring about a certain outcome. Like you're trying to force their hand to do something that you really believe is right.
Yeah.
But we don't get to control that.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
If you're loving them toward a certain end.
Yeah. Yes.
To manipulate them toward an end.
Yes.
Then you are not actually loving them. Yeah.
Yes. Because I just want to add in one more tiny little thought. And it's one of these things that I don't even know if I should say this, but I just have to say it because it came up for me so many times reading the text in preparation for this week. Like, those optical illusions. I should have brought one shared on the screen with you, but that wouldn't help our listeners. Okay. Those optical illusions where like it looks like something is sort of on the top, but then something twists and you can't really tell what is the top of this thing that's being depicted. Yeah. Like, and it sort of looks like it's like turning around on itself almost and gets very, I don't know, all twisty. This week in particular, and I think it was the use of Psalm 118 in the other text that is just such a resonant text for me that I just started to really feel like the text that I carry as a Jewish person is being turned around in ways here that ultimately, not even necessarily in this story, but in human history, come out as weapons against the Jewish people. And it's, even just reading the phrase like Jesus carrying his own cross, like I just have this imagery of like we bear this tradition that is ultimately somehow turned around against us in the course of history in this way that I don't quite understand and can't quite completely trace. But I don't know. I really felt the pain and the tension of that. And when I can stay inside the story, it's okay. I understand what's happening inside the story. But when I have these little blips outside the story to human history, it's hard. It's hard. So I appreciate you, and I appreciate people listening who try to offer some other contexts and other ways to think about these stories.
I appreciate your saying that, Amy, and I appreciate your reading this text with us. And, to me, what you're saying is if I stay in the story, it's okay. But once you step out of the story, then look what it's done in history. And to me, there is a message there about the urgency for those of our listeners who are Christians, and especially those who are Christians who proclaim the gospel in some context. Like, there is a way of interpreting these texts that is not, I don't know if it's not dangerous, but it's not as dangerous as the way the text is often interpreted. And, in keeping with the Gospel of John, the whole message of the Gospel of John is love each other, right?
Yeah.
And somehow that gets turned into a text that has been really dangerous for people. And so there is an urgency about good biblical interpretation that tries to make the world more loving and not more dangerous. And this text, as you are rightly saying, has been a text that makes the world dangerous. And we who have a chance to read it otherwise absolutely need to do that.
Thank you for that. And thank you for doing this work all the time, Bobby. All the time.
So next time we're going to continue on with difficult texts. We're picking up in the very next verse in John 19:23-42. This is our Good Friday special episode. I feel like we've been talking about the crucifixion for 6 weeks now. On our special episode, we'll actually talk about the crucifixion text itself. Then we get to move on to Easter and some other things.
Good.
All right, Amy, thanks so much for being here. I enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. Me too.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of BibleWorm. If you've enjoyed this free podcast, we hope you'll help us keep it going by joining our Patreon for as little as $4 per month. You can can also sign up for other goodies like early access, video lectures, weekly liturgies, and more. Visit patreon.com/BibleWorm podcast for details.
BibleWorm is produced by Bobby Williamson and edited by Joel and Laura Becker. Our theme song is sung by Colin Bagby. We are grateful to our many supporters for helping us keep the podcast going. A special thank you to our executive producer, Fox Valley Presbyterian Church in Geneva, Illinois.
Join us next time for our special Good Friday episode when we'll be discussing the end of the crucifixion narrative in John 19:23-42. Until then, keep on digging.